When Jimmy Barnes was a teenager, he and some mates kicked in the back door of the Apollo Stadium in Adelaide to see Tina and Ike Turner. Jimmy made his way to the very front and he was transfixed by Tina's power, her energy, her legs. He was also mesmerised by the driving power of the band under Ike Turner's direction. The magic combination Jimmy encountered that night of soul and force and precision is what he's aimed for with his own music. There have been many times with Cold Chisel and as a solo performer that he's got there. There have also been times when other things got in the way, booze and drugs and the demons of his troubled childhood. Over the last few years, Jimmy Barnes has been bringing those demons out into the light by writing the story of his life, first in Working Class Boy, then Working Class Man, and now in his new book, Killing Time. And a warning, Jimmy is very candid about his life story, and there are elements that some of you might find upsetting. Hi, Jimmy.
How you going, sir?
How well do you remember that Tina Turner gig?
I remember very well. I mean, I just remember that it was inspiring. Me and my mates, by the way, we didn't particularly go see Tina Turner. We'd just go to any concert at the Apollo Stadium, which was that was where all the international acts played in Adelaide. And we were just hoodlums. And so basically we'd go there and we had this system. We knew there was about, 10 or 20 of us. So we'd kick the back door in and there was only 2 or 3 bouncers. So they could only catch a few of us. So you'd sacrifice 1 or 2 of your best friends and then the rest of us would all get in. And we used to do this almost every week. And I've seen all sorts of weird and wonderful things. Of course, I'd heard River Deep, Mountain High, and I was a fan of that song, but I didn't really know what to expect. And when I got in there, of course, there's Tina, just looking fabulous in the front with the Ikettes. So I did what everybody does, I ran down the front, I got down the front, and it wasn't just, I was there and literally I was just all these legs in front of me. It was amazing. But more than that, it was just the intensity that the woman sang with and the power and the commitment to what she was doing was just so, and I was standing there and I was like mesmerised by this as a young, fella, I was 14 or something, and I've started a band of my own, we were in a garage band, and I was watching, I was just going, this is incredible. And I just happened for a second to gaze past these incredible women that were performing, and I seen this guy in the back, and I noticed everybody in the band was watching him, and he was the one that was bang. Every time he moved his leg, the band did an accent. It was intense, and he was he's a taskmaster, and it was Ike Turner. And so I know, and as everybody else does know, is that Ike turned out to be a really bad cat, but he knew how to run a band. I think that drive and that power that he was demanding from his band, he probably pushed Tina harder and harder every show. And obviously, because she did so much after she left Ike, she hadn't even hit full speed yet, so she was an incredible woman. And I was lucky, I watched the show and I went away and this is what I want to do. This is the way I want to drive a band. I want it to be that intense, that passionate, that where people cannot ignore it. And so I sort of applied that to my career forever. But I was lucky enough to work with Tina much later. And I tell you, quite often you meet people you've looked up to and, that's always nice, but they're mellowed or they don't live up to what you expected. Tina was everything and more. She was just frighteningly good.
I think by the time of that gig, you'd left school or were about to leave school. How were you making money as a teenager?
I left school and I worked in garages. We wouldn't, a couple of petty jobs. My parents wanted me to stay. My dad was sort of insisting that I sort of would only be allowed to leave school if I got an apprenticeship. But I managed to get out, and then he pushed me back into school again. And at about sort of 15 and a half, I applied for an apprenticeship at the South Australian Railways, and I got a job as a moulder in the foundry. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically like metallurgy. You work with molten metal, which is, when you think of a 16-year-old taking LSD and drinking all night, going to work in a foundry the next morning, pouring molten metal at 3,000 degrees centigrade isn't a very good thing to do. But, I turned up every day. I was a pretty good apprentice, apparently. And I stayed at that job for about 6 months, and I used to hitchhike to and from the in terrible states, Sometimes I go straight from being out to the factory.
And outside of the factory, on the streets of Elizabeth and the parts of Adelaide that you'd hang out in as a teenager, how rough did things get, Jimmy?
We just thought it was normal. It was sort of, it was rough at home. Most of these were fairly troubled homes, very poor, lots of drinking, lots of alcohol. So we were all quite used to the rough. And it was really an extension. When we got out as kids, we just did what our role models had showed us what to do. And that was if you didn't like something, you smashed it, So basically we were out in the streets. It was sort of gangs, street gangs. We'd all hang at the shopping centre every night of the week, and we'd walk the streets and look for trouble, whether it was, fighting or, if people didn't want to fight us, we'd find people who did, But I've got to tell you, even back then, I could fight because you had to fight. You either were aggressive or you were a victim. And so you sort of had to do it. But my heart was never really in it. And my friends there, who were probably even more troubled than I was, I remember lots of them, when they get in these fights, it was like near death. People were getting stomped in the gutters and hit with glasses and bottles and crowbars and anything you get your hands on. And I just could never do that, So I learned how to fight and take people on. I worked out early that if you pick the biggest guy with the biggest mouth, can't necessarily fight. So I was smart, I'd hit the biggess't then it'd be all over and I'd sort of wouldn't have to go berserk. And it was something that it just didn't sit with me even as a kid. I'm essentially a gentle sort of person. So I didn't have my heart in that. And I was really always music was my way of escaping from that violence. And so I would get the gang and said, we're going to go, let's go to the pub and fight. And I say, let's go to Apollo Stadium. And we'll go up there and start trouble. And basically every time we'd kick the door and, they'd go in looking for trouble, fighting bouncers or other punters, and I'd be watching music. I remember one night we kicked the door in and went in, and I'd never heard of Bob Marley before. Bob Marley was playing, and as soon as I got in, that sort of the whole arena just smelt funny. And I'm watching, I'm going, well, this is pretty good. And then the band started, and it was just frighteningly good. I've never heard a groove like it in my life. And, all my mates are just looking for trouble, trying to fight hippies. And I was just I was learning about music every day. So in the midst of all this violence, I was still, we'd go to the coffee shop, trying to pick up girls and do all that sort of stuff. And I'd be picking up songs from the radio, from the jukebox. I was the odd one out.
You come from a line of fighters. Your dad was a boxer, a really accomplished amateur boxer. Tell me the story of his being allowed in a prison cell back in Scotland with a man who'd assaulted your sister.
Well, yeah, it's sort of like Glasgow justice, My dad was very tough. He was featherweight champion of Britain and Scottish amateur champion, and he was a hell of a street fighter. My grandfather used to fight bare knuckles in the street. They were both hard men. And it runs in the family. It ran right past me. We lived in a place called Cowcaddens, which was a pretty rough suburb at the time. Anywhere in a city, Glasgow was pretty tough. And there was a back alley which they called a close, which was like where you put the rubbish bins, and it was the only toilet for the tenement buildings was there.
So you didn't have a toilet inside your apartment?
Didn't have a bathroom in the apartment. We'd wash in a bucket in the sink and all that sort of stuff. And you have to go down at night to the toilet, which was really dark and really frightening and really smelly. But my sister got dragged into a close by some bloke, and he tried to rape her. And, I'd have to speak to my sister, but I've never really spoke to her much about it. But anyway, they caught the guy. Some passerby intervened and stopped it, and they caught him. And at the time, my dad was Scottish champion, and the police took him down to the station, my dad, and said, this is the guy, and just put my dad inside with him, shut the door and left him for 20 minutes, And, it wasn't pretty. Violence gets violence, and it's the way we were, and that sort of led to the way we grew up as kids, because, that's how you dealt with your problems, with violence. And, I'm sure any father would have loved to have, been in that position, but it doesn't really help. But my dad gave him a terrible bloody hiding.
What are your own earliest memories of Scotland?
I remember I was talking to my mum, and I said, where's this house? And I sort of painted a picture, talked to her of this house that I really remembered, and it was a kitchen with a bed set. There was the stove there, a fuel stove, and a bed set against the other wall, which was sort of recessed with a curtain in it, and I said, I remember this house. She said, you can't. And I said, well, there's no photos. What is it? She said, that's the house you were born in. And so I remember, and we moved out of there when I was like 8 or 10 months old. But I remember, and it's almost like I can almost remember, being there on my mum's, bosom. It's one of those things. I don't know why it came so it was really vivid to me, and so that's my earliest memory. And I've spoke to therapists and stuff since then, and they say that people who have that early of memories, it's normally due to trauma. There's probably something horrible's happened in our house. I know lots of horrible things happened in our house. So I don't know what that particular thing was. But I remember very young. I remember Glasgow very well. It was a pretty frightening place for me.
What kind of noises do you remember? What were the sounds of Glasgow growing up?
I just remember it was loud. It was there was trams. There was, we were always out in the street because, you didn't stay home with your parents because they were, even at 4 years old, I remember every street had a gang, and the gang from the next street nearly killed a friend of ours and me. We were both 4 or 5 years old. They gave us a chance to run, and I ran away, and they were throwing bottles at us as I ran, and my mate froze, and they actually slashed his wrists, and he nearly died. And we were 4, for Christ's sake. All I remember is that it was very dirty. It was very, very damp. It was, those days, you see photos of Glasgow from the late 50s, 60s. It was like just a haze of smog from all the coal. There was, shipbuilding, foundries, funny enough, and every house was heated by coal. So it was all really sort of tense and tight feeling. And I just remember lots of shouting. My most vivid memory of the sounds is shouting and swearing. And we lived, there was a pub just down the street from us, and every night when closing time came, there'd be brawls and women sort of getting belted by their husbands and screaming as they try to drag them out the pub with their kids, and my mum would do the same. It was pretty horrible. But in saying that, it was funny because I left there when I was 5, but I didn't go back again until I was sort of 23, I think it was. And I remember I caught a train from London to Glasgow, and I got off the train, and from the time I walked from the train to where you get a taxi, halfway through the train station, this drunk guy tried to pick a fight with me, right? And I was just a stranger for no reason, just really drunk. And I was like, oh, Jesus. And then some other drunk guy came in and jumped in and saved me. Right. And they just sort of kept fighting, and I just kept walking, and I walked to the taxi, and it was like, I had this strange feeling of, I'm home. This is where I grew up. This is where I belong. And, it's a very strange thing. I was always afraid in Glasgow. But since writing these 2 books and realizing, because a lot of the stuff that happened to us as kids, I blocked completely out of my mind until just before I wrote these books. So I started doing therapy, really, because I was just, I was going crazy, trying to, I was going to drink myself to death and all that sort of stuff. And writing Working Class Boy and the therapy that led up to that really just opened up a hell of a lot. And I'd sit at my typewriter and write my computer, and I'd just start to write a story, and then suddenly all these memories would flood back, and it was like shock, because they were really quite horrible and violent, and there was abuse and sexual abuse and all sorts of stuff that went on. And that sort of unlocked this door. Writing those books unlocked this door that allowed all this stuff to come out. And that's why I was so frightened of Glasgow. I was so frightened everywhere. I was frightened anywhere I went. But since writing the books, I went back to Glasgow, and I suddenly, I could see it with a different light. And so, if nothing else, if I gained nothing else from writing the book, it was certainly it opened my heart so that I could live and see and feel again.
Trying to partly escape that violence and poverty, your parents moved with you and your brothers and sisters to South Australia. Tell me about the place they eventually settled. Tell me about Elizabeth.
Elizabeth was a really great idea on paper. I mean, it was literally, it was a satellite city about 20 kilometers or something outside of Adelaide. And really, they built the city just to give Holden's, put a factory there. And I think the South Australian government did a deal with Holden's that they bought this big package of land, which was absolutely horrible land, like nothing grows there. And they said, here, you can buy this cheap. And they put a factory up, and they said, and we'll give you a workforce, and they built this city for migrants there. And basically Elizabeth was, when I moved there, it was all neat and new, and it was, like the new suburbs in out of Sydney and all that sort of stuff. And by the time we left, 8 or 10 years later, it was, just horrible. It was, it all run down. But initially a great idea on paper. They put it all there, and they had everybody worked at Holden's, so they were all there, and there was a pub in every sort of district, so there was plenty of places for the men to get drunk before they went home to beat their wives and all this sort of stuff. So what happened was all the problems they had in Britain, and most of the immigrants were from Northern Britain, because it was a big push in Northern Britain then. And they just brought all the problems that they probably ran over. Like, I know my parents thought we could move to Australia and leave all our problems behind. My dad's violence and alcoholism and, whatever my mum was running from. There was all sorts of things. And they could come here and start fresh. And it doesn't work like that unless you address the issues, That's what I found out as well. So it was quite a violent place.
Well, you tell a story, I think, in Working Class Boy of visiting a family friend's house, and the fight breaks out between two brothers over some cigarettes. What happened?
I think it might even have been Christmas. I've got a feeling it was Christmas, and we were there. It was friends of my dad's, and it was, I was 8 or 9 or something like that. But this couple they had 2 sons. One was about 17, one was 18 or something like that. They were arguing about a packet of cigarettes when we got there. It was getting quite heated, and we were just all going to sit down for dinner. And one had stormed off in the bedroom, and the door slammed. And then we're all sitting at the table, and the other brother was sitting, just across the table from me. And during, before the meal was served, I think the brother came out of the bedroom and just grabbed him and slashed his brother's throat, cut his own brother's throat at the table at Christmas. And, and then walked out. And I didn't hear this till later, but apparently he just walked to the local shopping centre, picked up a rubbish can, threw it through a shop window, and went in and opened up a pack of cigarettes and sat there and waited for the police to take him away. Luckily for him, the brother didn't die, but he was, was badly wounded, couldn't hear his voice, and he was close to death. I used to see people, you see people get glassed at parties and all the time. And that's my parents' friends. They had parties every Saturday night, progressed, they were more often. But every time they had a party, they always started out really great. And by the end of the night, somebody grabbed, somebody else's wife's ass or something like that. And violence, it would be really violent, and there'd be blood spilt.
How did your big sister Dorothy try to keep you safe when your mum and dad were fighting?
Dot was sort of like because mum and dad were so caught up in their own shit, basically, they didn't care. They couldn't look after us. And so Dot was sort of looking after us. And Dot was, she's not that much older than me, she was 12 or something, 11 or something at the time. When these fights would start up, you could hear the voices would start raising. She knew what was going to happen. And she'd get us, the little ones, and she'd take us all, and we'd all climb into the cupboard, in the wardrobe, in her room, and she'd shut the doors and she'd cover us with, like, I remember she used to cover us with coats, the coats used to smell like my mum's perfume or my dad's cigarettes, and I'd sort of lie there, and it was sort of comforting, but you could hear the muffled sounds outside, and they'd get louder and louder, and then you'd be smashing and things flying around, and we just have to hide in there and wait, and this happened, many times, and then, we'd wait till it was quiet, and you sort of look out, and creep out the out of the cupboard into the kitchen, and the furniture would be smashed up. There'd be glass over blood. Mum would be lying in the corner. Dad had gone to the pub. It was just full on. It was horrible.
Where else could you go as a little kid that felt safe, Jimmy?
There wasn't many places. There was a paddock across the road from us, which was frightening too. It was really scary, and I'd seen people over there with flashers and all sorts of stuff. It was a weird place. Some nights I'd climb out the window because these fights were going on, and go and sleep in the paddock by myself, until 2 or 3 in the morning, until it's all gone quiet, and then come back in. And the thing was, I was 7 or 8 years old, and nobody noticed I was missing. They were too busy fighting and drinking to notice it. I used to go and stay with a friend of the family who sort of adopted me, another Scottish family, Mary, and I called her Auntie Mary. And she, I think she just knew that my parents were out of control, and she was just trying to save one of us. She could do a bit. So I used to go and stay with her a bit, and it was just a nice, quiet, normal house. And she had a budgie that she talked to, and it was, it was all sweet. But then I go back home, and I have to go back home, and it was just all still the same. One night, it was, rather than stay, it was so bad at home. And, there was my mum and dad would invite people to parties at the house, and they were just all, when you're addicted to something, you hang around with people you would never normally spit on, And so they'd have these really dodgy people in the house, and they'd be looking at you weird and, trying to touch you and, like all this sort of stuff. So I went and stayed with my mate one night, It was about 4 doors down. That night, his brother had came home and he'd been in jail. I don't know what for, but and 2 or 3 in the morning, he came into the bedroom and tried to shag both of us. Tried to shag me, and I just fought him off and climbed out the window. And we're babies. It was just atrocious way to bring up children. And when I think about that, it explains why all these kids grew up to be like that as teenagers, and a lot of the guys I hung around with, didn't make it out. A lot of them, ended up heroin addicts or died in fights or rotted in jail, for the, beat somebody to death or something. These guys were products of where we grew up.
Jimmy, what changed at home in the summer of 1965-66?
Well, my mum, we woke up one day, mum left, you see. I have mixed emotions about that, because I know I can look back now and say mum left to save her life. We know about domestic violence. You can't stay there and just put up with that sort of stuff. You have to get out. But unfortunately, mum left and left us with my dad. And my dad, who loved us, he was out of control and he couldn't look after us when mum was there. So when she left, it means there was nothing. There was no one to look after us. And my sister Dot was trying to do the best she could. And she was, she'd steal money out of his pockets when he'd come home drunk so she could feed us. I remember we used to buy these big, 5-10 kilo bags of potatoes and we'd drag them up the street and we'd live on that for the week, just the kids. That's all we'd have, just a bag of potatoes. And it was like living in bloody Ireland in the potato famine. My dad was just too busy drinking, and the violence got worse then. There was more fights. He might as well have gone as well because we were virtually alone. And the house, at least when my mum was there, she sort of tried to keep the place a bit clean and neat. But by my dad and we were too young, we didn't know what to do. And there was, the fights that they had in the house. There was, people's heads put through walls and windows were smashed, doors were ripped off the hinges, and it was just an unsafe place to be. And that went on for a couple of years. We were there like that. She left us for a couple of years, and I know why she left, but I can't help but think in my heart that she should have taken us too.
When did you next see her?
It was a couple of years later. She came back somewhere in the middle of it for a fleeting second. I seen her parked in a car outside the house, and I looked out the window and I knew it was her. And I ran to the door, and as I ran across the front lawn, the car sped off down the street, and I was chasing her down the street. It was just horrible. And I didn't see her again for months. And the next time she came, she turned up and she was with some bloke who was a really, really strange bloke. And she took us away for the afternoon it was a house. And it's funny because the house where she was staying, right, was where I used to run away. When my mum was gone, I'd pinch 2 bob out of my dad's pocket because it was lying on the floor, and there'd be people everywhere drunk on the floor, and I'd just sort of tiptoe over, steal 2 bob and leave at 5 in the morning and get a train to the Glenelg jetty, and I'd sit on the jetty and look out to the sea, and I literally as a 9-year-old sat on the end of 10-year-old sat on the end of the jetty thinking about committing suicide, and I'd sit there and I think I'd just swim out, and nobody would miss me. It's okay, and funnily enough, when my mum was away, she was living just down the road from that jetty, and I'd probably walk past the house, So she came and took us to this house, and I'm looking around. I'm going, oh, this is where I come. I didn't tell anybody. And the house was there was some fella there. I don't know who. I can't even remember his name, but he was really weird. And he had all these like kids' toys set up in his backyard, and it was all. And I just wanted to play with him, and he didn't want us to touch anything, and he was like looking at us weird. And Mum sort of knew something was wrong and took us back that afternoon, and we never see her again for another few months. And then eventually she came back with this guy who was a very strange looking fella, because we were all Scottish, Glaswegians aren't that tall, but she walked up with Reg Barnes, and Reg Barnes was like 6'6", and he was skinny, and he had a big nose. And I remember because as long as I've known Reg, he wore cardigans. He looked like Mr. Rogers, the neighborhood, that's the, and he was a really gentle soul. And she came back with Reg. And she just said, "Oh, you guys are going to come and spend the night with us." And I didn't realize then, but she obviously had spoke to my father, and we went to the house for the afternoon, and we just never went back.
What was that house like, Jimmy, where she lived with Reg?
We thought it was a palace, because it was really nice. Because by the time my mum took us, for that time, we were like, the mattresses were just like springs sticking out, and they were covered in blood and piss, and it was a horrible, no sheets, and we had blankets from the Salvation Army that were filthy, and we were starving and stuff like that. And we got to Reg's house, and it was, we had bunk beds, and it was really neat with sheets turned down, and it was all, clean towels, and there was food in the fridge. It was really great. And Mum said, "Look, you guys, you're going to have to stay with us." And we all went, "Yeah, okay."
Tell me what Reg would do after he cleared the table after dinner.
Reg, it's an Aussie from Port Adelaide, Reg. He was very, very straight and very settled in his way. I think he was going to be a priest at one point, but he was really so calm. And get everybody cleaned up, and they'd all got to get ready for bed. And I'd be in my pajamas, and he'd grab me and say, "Come here." And we'd go into the kitchen, and he'd set the table for breakfast, which was incredible because we'd, 2 meals in a row. Who knew, So he'd get me to help him because he always said, "Oh, you've got to do this stuff. You've got to help. You've got to pitch in." And then he used to like eating cereal at night. And so him and I would sit in the kitchen at night and have a bowl of cereal. And we wouldn't talk a lot, but it'd just be like this little moment alone. And he'd smile at me. And sometimes he'd tell me stories. Other times he wouldn't. By the point we moved in with Reg, I was so afraid I was like a nervous wreck. I was afraid of everything. And I used to wake up in the middle. It must have been a horror story for him, because we were all really bad. And my brother John was a delinquent, and him and my sisters were delinquents. And I was just at the point of becoming one. I was pretty bad. And he knew, and I'd wake up and I'd be screaming and have nightmares and sweating and all that sort of stuff. And he knew I was afraid of the dark. And as soon as he recognized that, he went to his parents' house in Port Adelaide and came back with us. It was like a lighthouse lamp. And it was, it was just really cute. And he put it on my desk, and he said, "Lighthouses shine out across the sea to help ships that are lost." He said, "This will do the same for you." And he said his dad gave it to him, and nobody ever gave me anything. And it just broke my heart. Reg was like that. He was one of the only shining lights in my life.
Podcast, broadcast, and online. You're listening to Conversations with Sarah Konoski. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app, or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
Jimmy, you were telling us how Reg Barnes came into your life and became this protector, but things were still rough with your mum and you were living a pretty wild adolescence. What happened when you were 16?
My mum kept getting drawn back to Elizabeth. As much as Reg wanted to keep us in this nice, picket fence sort of, clean, classic Australian home, and by the way, the castle was actually in a place called Wingfield in Adelaide, which was, 100 yards away from a meat tannery. Of a skin tannery, so it just smelled atrocious. There was septic tanks with sewage overflowing, but it was still better than where we were living. But Reg kept the house really neat, but Mum was like drawn like a magnet back to Elizabeth all the time. I think she felt out of place there. She felt ashamed of who she was, so she wanted to be around people like her. So she kept getting Reg to move back to Elizabeth, and of course, when we moved back to Elizabeth, I just fell back in with all my old mates from school, and that's when I was really running wild in gangs and stuff like that. And we were up to, we were just, out of control, bloody fighting and drinking and, all that sort of stuff. And one day, I found out that David Campbell was my son. I was 16, and my band played at the local community centre. I was a bass player. And in fact, the night that David was conceived, I think I broke 3 strings on my bass, and I didn't even care because it didn't matter. I wasn't using the other 3 anyway. But, it wasn't like she was my girlfriend, right? And we didn't, hadn't, been together or anything like that. And the two of us just didn't know what to do. And so David came along, and he was born, and it was decided that her mother was going to adopt David, and she brought him up. I wasn't capable of doing it anyway. I was, 16, and I was completely out of control and just starting to escalate. So by the time I was ready to really be a parent, it was many, many, many years later. But I always knew that I had a son, and I'd go and visit. I wasn't allowed to say that I was his dad because the grandmother just wanted to protect him, I guess. But it was a bit really difficult. And I'd go there, and I was sort of who's this guy? And David would be sent to, to come away with me for the weekend and stuff. And by this point, I was in a band, and I was in Cold Chisel, and I was, arriving in leather jackets and in limousines and stuff like that. And who's the drunken uncle with the limo?
Well, tell me, as you say, you're starting to play in bands, and I think, again, at just 16, you're asked to audition for this new band who go on to become Cold Chisel. Where was that audition held?
One of those times where I was at the shopping centre and looked for people to have fights with. And I'm standing there with the gang, we're all hanging out. And this guy walked up and he didn't look like he belonged. He was a bit of a hippie, and which would have made him a target, but he came straight up to me for some reason. He was lucky he didn't do one of the other boys because they would have killed him. And he knew that my brother John had a bit of a reputation, as John had been in bands since he was like 12. And this guy came up and said, "Oh, look, we're getting a band together and we're looking for a singer, and we hear you'll be okay. You might be as good as your brother." So I looked at him, and he was sort of real hippie, he had red eyes, he looked like he smoked too much dope, and his long hair and his glasses, and it did look like he didn't fit in with my gang. And I thought, well, this is the sort of guys, I don't think I'm going to fit in here. But he gave me a piece of paper and said, "Come to this address on Saturday if you're interested." And then he quickly got out, which was a wise thing to do. And I just shoved it in my pocket. I wasn't going to go. And then I'm standing there, and it was sort of one of these moments where you could get a bit of clarity. And I'm standing there and I looked at myself, and I'm, 16 years old. And I spend every night of the week hanging around outside a snooker hall, waiting to fight with somebody I don't even know. And I just thought to myself, what am I doing? What am I here for? What's this about? So I thought, I'm going to go. I'm going to go up to, and they gave me an address. It was in the city. Got the train up into town. Very nervous because I've been in bands, but only bands that I started, and were kids. And I'd never really auditioned, so I was really nervous, and I didn't take rejection well. I was on the edge, and I'd had a big night. And I found a place, and it was the Women's Liberation Hall in Adelaide, which I thought immediately they're taking the piss out of me here,
I had no idea that Cold Chisel started in the Women's Liberation Hall in Adelaide.
We rehearsed there for a long, long time, and they were really great. I mean, the women that ran this hall were fantastic, and we respected them, and we loved having the space to rehearse. But I got there, and I didn't want to come on. And anyway, I walked upstairs, and sure enough, there was a band in there waiting to rehearse. They were nothing like my mates. Don was, he looked like a uni student. He was, he was a physics student. Ian was a country boy from Mossy, was a country boy from Alice Springs. And Les, the guy who started Cold Chisel, Les Kazmarek, was a tall, good-looking, Polish bass player with big flares and really shiny gear. And, none of my bands had any equipment. We couldn't afford it. And I remember going in and I was really nervous. And I think Ian or someone said, "Oh, do you know any songs by Free?" And they were my favorite band in the world. I knew every song. So I said, "Yeah, I know a couple." So we sang a few songs, and immediately they let me join the band. I was like 16 and a half at that point, and that changed my life. It was sort of my ticket out. Standing in that corner, waiting to fight people didn't make any sense to me, and it hadn't ever made sense to me. It's like fate just all fell together, and I went, okay, I'm out. And if Cold Chisel hadn't come along, I think I would have just, jumped on a train or hitchhiked out, and God knows what I would have done. I reckon, like a lot of my mates, I probably would have been dead by now if I hadn't joined Cold Chisel.
The band's first album came out in early 1979. Who did you meet in November of that year?
Yeah, well, I remember, November 29th at 4:00 in the afternoon. I remember seeing Jane, my now wife. We were touring with the Angels, and we're all mates. We're managed by the same company. We're all touring together. And it was us and Flowers, who were to become Ice House later. And anyway, the Angels had some friends in Canberra, and we were in Canberra, Jerrabomber Avenue, Motel 7, I think it was. And we walked in, they were all just all, I think they were stoners, they were all going in and smoke pot. And I didn't smoke much pot, I didn't like downers, I liked uppers, So I walked in, and as soon as I walked in the room, I'd seen this girl across the room, and she was just beautiful. And she took my breath away. I went out the room again and sort of got myself together, but, tidied myself up. I wanted to be impressive, but I wasn't. She wouldn't even look at me, didn't say a word. She didn't say a word to anybody in the room. I sat there really quiet, and I'd never seen anybody look like her. She could have been from anywhere, but she was so exotic and so beautiful. And anyway, that, and I was sort of smitten from the minute I seen her. But that night we did a show at the university in Canberra, ANU. The Angels and Cold Chisel were doing this tour where one night they'd be on last, one night we'd be on last. It was like a double bill. As it happened, I'd played first with Cold Chisel, and then I was standing on the side of the stage watching the Angels, and this girl suddenly was there next to me, and I looked and I was like nervous, and she invited me to a party, and I was, I wasn't sure, I didn't know what to think, because how bloody thick I was, when she didn't speak or say it, and she was I thought maybe she didn't speak English, and that's a bit offensive, but she spoke 5 languages, she speaks English better than I did, but she invited me to this party at a friend's place, and Cold Chisel had a drummer who was standing in for Steve Preswick, and the drummer was Trevor Young. He was from the Lobby Lloyd's Coloured Balls. We were a skinhead band, and he was an absolute animal at the time. And him and I went to this party together, and it was a really nice, beautiful suburban Canberra house. When the parents were upstairs, and letting the kids have a party, and him and I got there, and I was being best behaviour. I was trying to impress this girl, and I went in, and I was like, I was already drunk when she came up and spoke to me, but I tried not to get any more drunk. So I went and sat next to her, and I was trying to be impressive to her. And in the meantime, my mate was trashing the Finjoit. And I'm sitting there, and Jane, I remember Jane was really, really cute and really nice, and she was just not like, I didn't know many people like her. And at one point she said, "Oh, I play music," and she knew about 4 chords at that point, and she played Puff the Magic Dragon to me. And I'm sitting there, I'm going, "Are you serious?" This was in my internal dialogue going, "I can't believe this girl. Is she really playing this bloody song?" And anyway, so that was great, And then my mate had caused too much trouble, and they threw us out. And I thought I'd never see her again. And she said, "Oh, give me a number, and I'll call you tomorrow." And I thought, I'm getting the elbow here. We've tossed out. They called me a cab, and I thought I'd never see her again. I was a bit heartbroken. And sure enough, she seen me the next day. She came to the airport where we were flying out, and then she gave me her number, and then I stalked her till she went out.
Well, it worked. You must have made an impression. You got married, you started having kids, and at the same time in your life, Cold Chisel is getting bigger and bigger. Yeah. The band breaks up, and then your solo career just gets bigger and bigger, and you're making number ones, and you're making a huge amount of money. And what were you spending all your money on back then?
Oh, I was out of control. I mean, really, I spent a lot of money on drugs and booze, and I wasted the rest. No, sorry, that's an old joke. You've got to get it in. I wanted to buy my kids everything I didn't have. And Jane, funnily enough, Jane realised that I didn't talk much about my past because I was ashamed of where I came from. But Jane knew that I was poor and that I didn't have a lot. And so she wanted to give me everything that she had. So it was like Jane lavishing things on me and me lavishing things on our kids. So we bought a farm with a beautiful recording studio and there was nannies and karate instructors and cooks and we had everybody. Once we made money, everybody we knew had money. Because we were very, very generous. And I built this house, which was way too big for what we needed and spent way too much money on it. So I was virtually touring, trying to pay back loans, and it was like, it was making me work and I wasn't working for the right reasons. So Jane just said, let's just get rid of it all. So, we sort of filed for Chapter 11 or whatever it is and sort of went to bankruptcy and sold everything. Paid off all the debts, paid everybody we could and moved away to France.
It's kind of amazing listening to your story and reading your books, Jimmy, is how you managed to keep functioning and keep performing and keep making albums given the intensity of your addictions during these periods. So tell me about the Sydney Olympics. You were the final act in the closing of the Sydney Olympics. What was going on that night?
You got to remember that as soon as I realised that music got me away from the life I'd been brought up with, I was never going back. And it was either going to die, trying or keep. And I just kept plowing forward. No matter what I threw at myself, no matter what the world threw at me, I'm a hard person to knock down. And I'm intense, I'm hyperactive, and I'm driven. If something fails, you get up, pick yourself up, and you charge again, and you keep going till you knock it in. And that's the way I approach the music business. I'm relentless. People say, what do you do? I'll make 3 records in a year or something, and I just keep throwing them out there, and I keep working hard. But at the same time, a lot of that was drug fueled, and the work I'd do would suffer because of it, But I just kept picking myself up, when I couldn't see anymore, and I'd throw another pile of rocket fuel into me and go again. So by the time the 2000 Olympics came, I was an absolute mess. I was taking so many drugs, and they wanted me to sing at the closing ceremony, and it was a big honor, a big gig, and I didn't want to let everybody down. And I remember I had to share a dressing room, which was like a sports bathroom sort of thing. I was sharing a dressing room with Slim Dusty, Paul Hogan, and and Greg Norman. And they're all in there, and they're all proper, and I was wasted. I hadn't been to bed when I got there. I was going at the bathroom and doing lines of cocaine, and I was in the shower cubicle smoking hashish. And
With Slim Dusty in the same room, Jimmy.
At one point, because I was getting ready to go on, and I warm up very unconventionally. I'll scream a lot, So I'm screaming like a banshee, like really loud, and this big security guy bursts in, right? And he goes, "What's going on?" And I look around the room, and there's only Slim there. Slim's sitting there, was really quiet. He's got his hat on his lap like that. And I said, "It's him. He's an animal." And Slim was really sweet. And I couldn't believe it because, Slim was a legend. And it was a gentle, beautiful soul, right? And he said to me, "I'd really like to do a duet with you one day. What's that song you sing about Vietnam? You wanted to do a duet with Case. Imagine if I had done K-Sam with Slim Dusty. It would have been fabulous. We just never got the chance to do it."
I want to hear that. Absolutely. I mean, it's funny, Jimmy, like they're mad stories. And I'm so glad that you didn't, forget the words to Working Class Man in front of 8 billion people or whatever could have gone wrong. But my gosh, you must look back and think, I was really flying close to the wind then. Like there must have been a lot of pain driving that kind of behaviour.
All I wanted to do was escape myself. I didn't like me, and I didn't like where I came from, and I didn't like what was eaten away inside me, and I didn't want to look at it. And the more I medicated, the more I drank, the more I ran, the less I had to look at myself. And it took a point where I kept running. And it's one of those. I learned this lesson where it took me a long, long time that you can't run away from anything. If you're running from anything in the world, eventually you're going to trip or it's going to catch you. You're going to have to. The best thing you can do is turn and face it. And that's the last thing I wanted to do. And I ran for as long and as hard as I could until I couldn't run anymore. And so that's when I started to work and really get help. And it was funny, as soon as I cleaned up my act, once that was healed, I can look back, still just as painful to look at it. And, and there's times where I stand and look in the mirror and just wonder how, what happened. I'm so lucky to be here. But if I hadn't have done that, I would have certainly been gone.
You had a couple of stints in rehab, including a month in Arizona in the States. How hard is that to go through, to go cold turkey?
You know what? Going for rehab to work for you, you have to go knowing that it's not for anything else, for any other reason except to help yourself. I was going because everybody wanted me to. And so I went there and I can put up with this, for a month, and it drove me nuts, and they were all bloody, kumbaya and sort of holding hands and sitting in the desert. I'm going to punch holes in your aura, but it was really, I got straight and then I got out and then eventually I drifted back into what I was doing. I went back into another rehab and drifted back into what I was doing. But every time I did something, I learned something. I'd had collected enough knowledge, even unwillingly, all the way through. Jane was always there supporting me and, bringing bloody, Buddhist monks up to the house and giving me blessings and Deepak Chopra used to come and hang out with me and try to talk sense into me, and all the way through all these little things that this really beautiful community of people gave me, left me with little bits of ammunition to fight. And when it came to the point where I really needed it, I did it myself. And it was because I'd gathered all this information and had so much love and help from other people. So I was a really lucky person. And I am a lucky person.
Flame Trees is a Cold Chisel song about going back to your hometown. What's it been like for you to sing that song over the years?
Different times, different things. It's always been. I thought it's always been a beautiful song. It's a lovely melody. I mean, I taught rock and roll 101 at Berklee College of Music in Boston. My son was a graduate from there, and they invited me to teach a rock and roll band how to put a rock and roll band together. And one of the teachers was using the songwriting teachers was using Flame Trees as a description of a perfect song. It was written by Steve Presrich and Don Walker, and after he died, it became really, really difficult to sing. And so, I used to sing that song quite often. Most nights have a big lump in my throat, and it was really difficult. Of late, since writing has become a bit easier because I can appreciate the song for the beauty of what it is. But I also had this other epiphany. I went back recently to Elizabeth. I was on tour, and I was going to do a show in the Barossa Valley, and I drove through Elizabeth. And Jane was with me. And every time I went to Elizabeth, since I was a kid, a sense of pain and fear, and it was like a weight all over, like a blanket thrown all over me. And I remember this time I went back, and I got there, and it didn't look any different. It was more falling down. It was more graffiti, and it looked worse and all that sort of stuff. But I felt a sense of belonging. But I remembered sort of standing there and my mates playing football and I was against the world. And I remember my brother singing to me and it was just suddenly I felt like I was home. And it was a really strange, I called it a broken homecoming. The whole cycle, I'd gone round and I'd let go of all that stuff. And Elizabeth wasn't the problem. We were the problem.
You've got 7 kids, counting at the moment, grandkids, great-grandson. Given the way you were raised... Two grandsons, great-grandsons. Given the way that you were raised, has it been hard knowing how to parent, how to be a patriarch in a big family like that?
I tried to be a good supplier, be encouraging. Even through my darkest days, I was drug addict, rock and roll star, bloody drunken, 7 number 1 albums in a row and still coaching the under-7 football team, But I tried my best all the time to be as good as I could. But, of course, looking back, I can see so many things I did wrong as a parent. I know for my kids, talking to them now as adults, they sat and they were watching and worried about me every day. And that's abuse in its own way, and that's something that I have to learn to live with, but I don't, since I've grown through that, we spoke about it a lot and it doesn't make it any easier. Mahalia used to come on tour with me, and she told me that there was a point there where she used to dread getting up in the morning and going knocking on my door because she just thought I wouldn't be awake. I'd be dead. And to put your daughter through that it's a horrible thing. That's as much abuse as what I received from my family.
I think about it though, Jimmy, when you describe either hiding in that wardrobe with your siblings or taking off across the paddock by yourself. Like, you were so alone as a kid, but you've built this big clan. You've built this big tribe of people who love you.
Yeah, and the thing is, what I realized was I had built all this stuff around me and had people who loved me, but I wouldn't let them in until not so long ago. I was always waiting for everybody going, you're not good enough. I was waiting for people to see the real me and go, we don't like you. And, because I didn't like me. It's taken a long, long time for me to get to the point where I can breathe now and allow, myself to feel that love and to see it and feel like I deserve it or whatever. And that's not a sob story. So I was always ready just to smash and move on. Just like my parents, really. When I think about it, I was always ready just to put my hands up and fight my way out and just, and leave everything. If it all came to the worst, I'd just storm off. And I realized that. And once I dropped my guard, I could start to feel the love. Life is so much easier.
For everyone, I bet, around you.
For everybody.
And when I think about the early drive to sing was partly about that battle, partly about that posture of taking on the world. What drives you singing now? What do you call on when you make music now?
I used to tap into so much pain and fear and love and hope and anger all the time when I sang. I was singing Don Walker's lyrics, in early Cold Chisel days. And I thought he was reading my mail, It was like, there was I'd read so much into them. And I'd automatically, when I'd say, I want to be angry, I could just go, boom, I'm there. Because I could just tap into it. And that was unhealthy because I didn't know what I was doing. So now, when I sing, I try to bypass my brain. I don't want to think. I want to feel an emotion. It comes out in the way I sing. I sing. I draw on the pain that I felt. I draw on the anger with myself and the fear and the same things. Only the difference is I'm aware of it now, and it's easier to access. And I think because of that, I'm a better singer. And I feel now that I'm singing better than I have in my whole career. I feel, I'm more rewarded from the sing. When I sing, I feel I've done something. I feel like I've connected with someone. It's not about blocking or charging or just, I was trying to get in people's faces saying, get away from me, every minute of my life, for 50 years.
Not anymore. Jimmy, it's so great to talk to you. Thanks so much for being my guest on Conversations.
Anytime.
For more episodes, hit subscribe or grab the ABC Listen app and listen to this show and many others all ad-free.